Hi, everybody. Welcome to Saddleback. Have I told you lately that I love you? This weekend, I'm actually in Berlin, Germany, where we're celebrating the 6th birthday of Saddleback Berlin, our campus there. Then I go on to Africa, where in Rwanda, I'll teach a purpose-driven leadership conference and also spend 3 days with the Bible Societies of Africa, speaking 3 times in 3 days. Then I'll be coming back home. Now, I want you to save 3 dates, one in November, one in December, and one in January. I want you to know about these in advance. November 10th, Sunday evening, we're going to do the 2020 Vision Rally, where I'm going to share with you all of the goals that we're going to go after in the next decade at Saddleback Church. A big, powerful, fun, inspiring Vision 2020. That rally will be Sunday night, November 10th. You plan on being here for that. And then number 2, December 3, 4, and 5 is our 3-day Finishing the Task conference, where leaders from all around the world come in and help us plan mission strategy to reach the whole world. If you care about the whole world, if you care about missions, I want you to sign up for Finishing the Task conference, December 3, 4, 5. And then January 25 is the actual 40th birthday of Saddleback Church. 40th birthday, January 25. We're going to call that Homecoming Sunday. And we're inviting every former member and every former staff member to come to Saddleback on January 25th. If you know somebody who was a member of Saddleback in the past 40 years, we want to get their address so we can send a special invitation so everybody can come and be a part of Homecoming Sunday, January 25th. Now, this weekend, we're continuing our series on counterculture living in an age of outrage. If you missed the first 2 messages, go back and watch them online, including my message last week on counterculture kindness. This week, we're going to look at counterculture community. And back is the author of the book, Christians in an Age of Outrage, Dr. Ed Stetzer. Give him a warm welcome.
Hey. Well, it is good to be here, Saddleback. Good to be here this weekend. So glad to be able to share with you. Love the, what a privilege that Pastor Rick Warren calls you up and says, hey, we want to do a series on your book, Christians in the Age of Outrage. And it's interesting because, he wrote a book, just a couple, and they sold, if you've got 60 million copies, I think, Purpose-Driven Life. But when you put Purpose-Driven Life together with Christians in the Age of Outrage, they've sold over 60 million copies. So it's really pretty exciting to see that. So, it's interesting, though, because this theme is a theme that I wish we weren't talking about. I wish we didn't have to have a series at Saddleback Church and other churches around the country to talk about outrage, but the world we live in is broken and divided, and it seems to be getting worse. I will tell you a true story. When I started thinking about writing a book, the publisher said to me, Tyndale is the name of the publisher, they said, hey, listen, why don't you write a book about outrage? And it was 2016, it was in the middle of a presidential election season. Everyone seemed pretty upset about something. And so I said, okay, well, but my question to them was, when you write a book, it takes me a year to write a book, and then it's got to go through the system and gets edited and eventually, through stores and put out. And so I said, that's going to be like 2 years by the time it'll actually come out. And I said to them, it's 2016. People are mad now, but are they really going to be mad 2 years from now? And it appears the answer is so. Because the outrage we find just seems to be going up. And it's not just here. It's all around the world. All of our 18 Saddleback campuses around the world are finding increased division in and around them. This is not unique to one country or to one context. So today, we're going to talk about counterculture community in the age of rage. And I want to talk about the power of a gospel-shaped people in the midst of a rage-filled world. And it's real simple. We're going to talk about living like Jesus, doing it with others, letting love be our guide, and being thankful, just knowing He's got this under control. We're going to see the power of community when Christ is at the center of that community, when He is all and He is in all. We're going to focus in a passage here in Colossians. So if you have a Bible, you can take it out, follow along with us, or if you're watching online, you can just turn over and pull them to the side screen as well. But I want you to look at Colossians chapter 3 is going to be our text, and we're mainly going to look at Colossians 3 chapter 3, verse 12 and following, but there's a theme here we need to know before we get to verse 12, and there's facts in verses 9 and 10 that we need to know. So verses 9 and 10 speak about, well, let's look at Colossians 3, 8 through 11. I've excerpted parts of it. Here's what it says. But now you must also rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language. since you have taken off, this is the key theme, since you've taken off the old self with its practices and put on the new self, here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. So that's just before verse 12, where we're going to spend most of our time. Some great stuff here. You could, just by living this, you could get along with so many people that maybe there's conflict in and around right now. But part of this has to recognize that we're being put into a new kind of community. We're not just solitary individuals who are trying to get along with others, but we've been put into a new kind of community. And in this community, Paul writes to the people here in Colossians, and he says, here, in this community, here, there is no Gentile or Jew. There's no circumcised or uncircumcised. It's barbarian, Scythian, slave or free. So, I mean, it goes through, right? Slave or free. There's no contrast between those in those different roles. A barbarian or a Scythian, which probably means just a really bad kind of barbarian because of the time and the history of people called Scythians. Or it says circumcised or uncircumcised, which I'm going to leave to your pastor to explain. And Gentile, or guest speaker, so Gentile or Jew. So all these contrasts are actually there. But so the community, here there is, in this community, here there is no these contrasts, but Christ is all and is in all. So it's not just community, it's a Jesus-shaped community. It's a gospel-centered community, and Christ is all and in all. So the main passage we're going to look at is actually not what we just discussed, but the main passage we're going to look at is Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 and following. I'm going to kind of break it down at each point, but just to remind you, again, we're going to talk about the power of a gospel-shaped people in the midst of a rage-filled world. We heard Pastor Rick talk last weekend about using the Good Samaritan, about how we want to be the most loving church, Saddleback and all 18 campuses, the most loving church with the most loving people, right? So that's going to be from the power of a gospel-shaped people in the midst of a rage-filled world. And it's real simple, but very difficult. We got to live like Jesus, do it with others. Let love be your guide and be thankful because he's got this under control. So let's look through this. Number one on our outline, you can take out your message note sheet and follow along, right? Jot that down. Number one on our outline is to look like Christ, is to look like Christ, right? So we're going to start with you, and it's personal. It's me and you, but it's in community. We're going to see that together. Why? Because we're talking about counterculture community in the age of rage. But it starts with you, but even here you'll see it's plural. It says this in Colossians 3:12. It says, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved. Boy, that's a beautiful description of us, isn't it? God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved. Clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, right? Clothe yourself with these things. So there's a kind of a picture going on here. And the picture is take off these clothes and put on these clothes, right? Because you are this new creation in Christ, right? So, and I'm convinced that a Christian in biblical community who is putting on these clothes or these attributes or these characteristics, a Christian who's putting on these clothes / characteristics is going to be in biblical community. It's the best antidote to an outraged world. And we need that, right? We need that all around the world. We need that. Now I love how it talks about us as Christians, right? God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved. Holy, H-O-L-Y. And it comes from the same root word that our word holiday is actually drawn from, right? What is a holiday? It's from the word holy day. What's a holy day? It's a day set aside for a purpose, a remembrance, right? So we might have a national holiday. An Independence Day of a nation is a holiday. It's a day set aside for something. Well, so here's us, right? So now we are God's chosen people, thank God for that, holy or set aside and dearly loved. Aren't you thankful that God dearly loves you? I mean, what a great phrase. We're dearly loved. And so what happens is we're asking this question, should Christians who are God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, should they live different than the world? Well, that's what this passage is about. This is who we are, okay? We are God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved. So clothe yourselves with these characteristics or these attributes. Now, the problem is a lot of Christians don't seem to be getting the message. And sometimes it's us, and we're not getting the message. Because it doesn't mean that every Christian, like one Christian is mean all the time. But sometimes we find ourselves in a fearful or frustrating situation when we don't clothe ourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. So sometimes it's us. But sometimes it's maybe someone we've encountered. I bet, just by show of hands, all of our campuses, how many of you would say that you've had a really difficult encounter with an angry or upset or mean Christian? Raise your hand for just a second. Okay, lots of hands, right, all over. How many of you have been that angry or mean Christian? Okay, maybe, because it could be, right? It could be. Sometimes we don't even know. Someone came to me probably 2 years ago and said, man, you really hurt my feelings when you said this. And I'm like, I don't remember saying that, but boy, I am super sorry. I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. And let me just think about it, because sometimes it's us. Right? So what we have to do is to intentionally clothe ourselves, compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, right? Now here's what I want you not to miss, because these are things that we do in community. It says God's chosen people. It doesn't say God's chosen person. Right? So we're in this community together, right? And so then there's this idea that in community we're gonna sort of put on new characteristics or attributes. Now I don't know a lot about clothing or fashion, and I thought, how can I illustrate this point? And I said, well, I could take off my clothes and put on new clothes, and I thought that would traumatize all of us. And so I said, let's not do that. But you get the picture, right? I mean, the picture is you are something, so put on these things, right? What does this spiritual fabric look like in the flesh? Well, it tells us, right? Because holy, dear beloved, clothe yourselves. So put on these spiritual attributes. So what does it look like? It looks like compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Pastor Rick talked about the Good Samaritan and how the good, and Samaritans weren't good. That's why the phrase was so shocking. Any person in that day that Jesus was speaking to, they didn't think the word good and Samaritan fit in a sentence. They were bad Samaritans. So Jesus tells a shocking story of a good Samaritan. And Pastor Rick encouraged us last week to be that kind of person. Well, today, I'm going to talk about the virtues and the values that actually we have to put on to be that kind of person. So let me say this. And I'm not saying it's you, I'm not saying it's me, but the reality is we've sometimes see in the church that people over time become more religious, and religious people can become more judgmental, and judgmental people can become more angry. But listen, if being a Christian has made you mean and angry, that's not Jesus shaping your character, that's something else. It might be legalism, it might be your religious desire to do whatever, but these characteristics are the alternative. They're the defining virtues of a community of living together for Christ, right? So this passage, though, it targets our flesh. I look at this and I'm like, I'm not this all the time. I need more of this in my life. Now, here's the thing I don't want you to miss. The syntax, in other words, how the sentence structure is basically saying this: you are these things, right? Chosen, holy, deeply loved. You are these things, so put on these things. So it's very connected. So we are these things, therefore put on these things. As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, put on. And we do think of it that way, right? So we put on dress shoes for fancy events, right? We maybe wear white pants for the summer. Some of our campuses actually have these things that the people here, where I'm speaking right now, wouldn't be aware of, called winter clothes. Right, so maybe you've heard of winter clothes. Some campuses know that, right? Maybe a special suit when you're doing an interview or something like that. Or maybe something called, I've heard people talk about gym clothes. I haven't experienced that, but I've heard that such a thing exists. So these are the virtues to put on, right? We're putting on compassion, kindness, humility, and it's a beautiful thing. But here's something fascinating. In and around that day, making lists of virtues was actually not an uncommon thing when Paul wrote these virtues to the people at the church called the Colossians. And so people would write these lists, but humility, this is fascinating, humility was not considered a virtue in the Roman Empire. Being humble was not a good thing. Which sort of makes sense in a world that's ruled by powerful people who being humble would be a bad thing. So all of a sudden the gospel provides a very countercultural message, right? Remember the title of this message boils down to counterculture community in the age of rage. So we hear these things that we're to put on, right? Compassion, kindness, humility. Humility is not even one that the culture would have valued. And it talks about gentleness or patience. Boy, those are things that I think we all struggle with, but here's the thing I don't want you to miss. When you walk in those virtues, it can be a beautiful opportunity to God to open doors or open our eyes to things we might not see otherwise. Let me give you an example that I picked up. So actually, someone shared this with me, and it tells a story of a taxi driver in New York City. And he was going to take his last quick drive of the day, pick up one more fare, deliver that one more fare. And he arrived at the address where they called in, it was dispatched, and waited, beeped the horn, waited several minutes, and nobody came out of the house right away. And so he was thinking about driving away, but something told him to go knock on the door. So he goes and knocks on the door and greets a small woman in her 90s. And she gave him the address that said, hey, could we kind of drive through the city, downtown, before we get there? And he learned from her that she was on her way to hospice care, where the terminally ill will be tended to, cared for. And the hospice care is a key ministry that many of us are familiar and engaged with. So she was on her way to hospice care. And so he just took her through the city for 2 hours. He writes this, his words, "We drove through the neighborhood where she and her husband had lived when they were newlyweds. She had me pull in front of a furniture warehouse that had once been a ballroom where she had gone dancing as a girl. Sometimes she'd ask me to slow down in front of a particular building or a corner, and we'd just sit staring into the darkness, saying nothing." He goes on and says she was finally tired, and so he drove her to the hospice and wouldn't let her pay. He goes on and he writes this. He says, "Almost without thinking, I bent and gave her a hug. She held on to me tightly. 'You gave an old woman a little moment of joy,' she said. 'Thank you.' And I squeezed her hand," he wrote, "and then I walked into the dim morning light. Behind me, a door shut. It was the sound of the closing of a life. I didn't pick up any more passengers that shift. I drove aimlessly lost in thought. For the rest of the day, I could hardly talk. What if that woman had gotten an angry driver or one who was impatient at the end of his shift? What if I had refused to take the run or had honked once and then driven away? On given review," he writes, "I don't think that I have done anything more important in my whole life." See, I don't want you to miss that, because even here he talks about how patience was part of that process. So these attributes with which we're to clothe ourselves really open the door for God to use us and to bless us at times and to help grow us at other times. So when we listen, when there's patience, this is not an area where I'm always the strongest, right? I'm not always the strongest. I'd love to go through all of these attributes here. I just mentioned patience, but we can talk about kindness and humility, but they only give me 40 minutes to do a message because they're not very patient on the tech team here at Saddleback. No, I'm kidding. But we could go through all of them. Each of them open new doors and new ways and new things to see. So number one, right, live like Jesus. Number two, forbear and forgive. Forbear and forgive. Now, my guess is you haven't used the word forbear in a while, but you probably know what it is. In case you don't, it's not a common word, but it means patience, self-control, restraint, and tolerance. It's basically forbearing. It's like a positive way of saying putting up with, right? I'm forbearing with somebody. And we're going to look at forbear and forgive. Now, the translation we're using here actually translates it bear with. Well, let's look at it. It's Colossians 3:13 in the New International Version. It says, "Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone." Now, don't miss this. We just had these attributes put on. Now, bear with one another, forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against anyone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. So don't miss this. The call here is to forgive as the Lord forgave you. Now, I'm using the word forbearance, which again is not a normal word that we use a lot. Many of you might say, that sounds like the King James Version of the Bible, and it is. It's from the King James Version of the Bible, and it doesn't really say, "Thou mustest forbeareth with thy neighboreth," but it's an older word that I think has more meaning to it than bear with, Because really, by forbearing with people, we practically live this out by forbearing and forgiving. And here's the thing I want you to miss, right? Don't miss how beautifully this is tied into the gospel itself. Hopefully you got that note sheet right there in front of you. If you're watching online, you can jot this down somewhere else as well. Here, don't miss this. I want you to circle. You've got your paper right here. I want you to circle the word as. It's in the second sentence, second word. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. So this is not just some generic, I should forgive because, I don't know, it's the right thing to do. Maybe I'll feel better if I let it go. But I'm forgiving in the manner and by the means of the gospel itself, of Christ's work himself, right? Forgive as the Lord forgave you. So I forbear, right? So forbear means, if you will, to sort of it's a good side of putting up with somebody for good motives and good reasons. And sometimes it can be little things, right? I put on Christ in the power of the Holy Spirit, and now for little things, I don't want them to get under my skin, right? People, for example, not using their turn signal. People who think that their cell phone is the speaker phone, walking around like this all the time. People who slow drive in the passing lane. Okay, I gotta stop. My flesh is just right now. I gotta get back to this passage, right? Forbear the driver in the wrong lane. Again, Lord, help me and help us. But the Gospels are motivation for forbearing and forgiving. Forbearing and forgiving. Now, here's the thing I want you not to miss, right? The reason I like the word forbear rather than bear with, because it speaks to sometimes the challenge of the situation. Here's the deal. I want you not to miss this, right? Easy people are easy to forgive, right? What I'm talking about here is the person who is more difficult, the situation, the workplace, the family, the neighborhood. Forbearing is harder, right? So burdensome people are harder to forbear and to forgive. Some people are just more burdening in how they are. Now, right now it says, if that person is sitting next to you, do not look at them right now. You did, I saw several of you do that, right? It's like, he's talking about you, right? He's talking about you. But here's the deal, I may also be talking about you, because all of us in different times get into that situation. And it's amazing what people can do when maybe they're afraid, or maybe they're angry, or they're frustrated. So I'll give you an example. And it also relates to community, because remember, we're talking about counterculture community in the age of rage. Okay, so I when I flew to come give this message this weekend, I got on a plane, and it was United Flight 684. And so I get on United Flight 684 to come here where I'm delivering this message this weekend. And so we had this sense that we were all associated. There was an association with us because all of us were looking at our boarding passes, and it said we were on United Flight 684, and it said gate E8. Now, so that meant that me and all of the people who are associated with United Flight 684 all make our way to E8. And then a really nice lady gets on the microphone and the speaker, and she says, we're gonna start boarding people. And so then, groups, people start boarding by groups. The first group looks down on the other groups in shame as they walk by to sit. Anyway, that's another story for another day. Okay, so then we walk down, we're waiting in the same gate area, E8. We walk down the same tube, if you will, into the plane. Then we sit in the same seats, just uncomfortably close to one another, and here we are, like really close to one another. So we are in association with one another. But then it got a little dramatic. So I'm sitting there in my seat, and some guy gets on the plane yelling and runs down the aisle shouting. Okay, this is a true story. I'm not making this up. This is not a pastor's story. This actually happened. So he runs down the aisle shouting, who will give us some space in the overheads for our musical instruments? Please, people, please. Now, you may be here at this service right now, and so I am telling the story accurately because this is where he and his wife went, was right here. So if you're here, welcome, but you could have been a little calmer. So what happens is the gate agent follows him in and says, get off this plane. And they say, no, we're not getting off this plane. And I'm saying, I know what happens next, is what I'm saying. I've seen the video, so I'm watching, right? So I'm just waiting, right? And so what happens is that the wife comes on, and I didn't get either of the names because I was too far away, but she actually gets on her knees in front of the gate agent, and you know what all the brave people around do? Here's what they do. So there's like 30 people videoing this at the very moment. Now the guy from the gate agent, he knows that everyone's videoing him, and nobody got the video of the guy screaming, running down the aisle. All they got is a picture of this woman on her knees saying, please don't take us off of the plane. So he thinks, I don't want to be on television. I mean, I don't know what he thinks. But he says, they kind of work a negotiation out. But here's the thing. People were yelling, people were mad at the gate agent, and then people were mad at the musicians, and all of a sudden, this whole group of people that were only united 684 is divided and not sure who's with whom. And I'm sitting there saying, this is a great sermon illustration. The Lord sometimes gives me those sermon illustrations. So we took off. Now we were still associated. We were just flight 684. We had some drama. Those people were still on the plane. Some people were mad. Some people were happy. A little turbulence started, and I'm thinking, opportunity to share the gospel, right? So I can start preaching right there. I didn't take the fullness of that opportunity. But then we land, right? And we go through the same tube out, and we then are done. And here's the thing, right? So we're together for over 3 hours, sitting so close to one another that it just shouldn't be, and yet we have association, but there's no actual participation in one another's lives. Now, here's the thing I don't want you to miss, right? We had proximity. Oh, do we have proximity? We had proximity, but we didn't have community. Now, here's the challenge. For a lot of people, you sort of have a service time that you come to. You're at Saddleback, and you got a campus and a number of the time you come. And we go through the same doors, and we sit in seats, sometimes uncomfortably close to one another, and we face forward without necessarily moving into any sense of life-changing community. And I just want you to hear this. I think for too many people at our 18 campuses around the world, you are in association with Saddleback, but not in participation with the lives of fellow believers. You're in proximity. God's calling you to be in community, and the necessity of that is where you will learn to forbear and to forgive. Now, I know some of you just went, well, I really liked that speaker until a minute ago. But I gotta tell you, you gotta live this out. Now, sometimes we live that out in close family relationships or neighbors or more, but this means for us, some of you have been in association with Saddleback for too long. You need to be in participation. You need to move from proximity to community. You need to move from sitting in rows to sitting in circles. You need to be in a counterculture community to live well in the age of rage. And at every one of our campuses, there's a connection center that you can go to right after this service, and you can say, I need to connect better. You know why? Because the power of a gospel-shaped people is immense in the midst of a rage-filled world. So we're gonna live like Jesus, right? We saw that by putting on these attributes. We're gonna do it with others. We're gonna forbear and forgive in community. We're gonna let love be our guide, and to be thankful. Now let's go on to number 3 on our outline. You can jot it down, right? It's real simple. Lead with love. But what's the thing that comes first is love. Now where do we get that from? You know, I've noticed that, man, some Christians love to tell one another how mature they are. And I don't know that maturity is measured by how many Bible verses you know. I think it's probably measured better by how many fruit of the Spirit you're living out in your life. And people say, well, I want to be mature. I want deeper teaching. What you need is deeper character sometimes. Now, again, I'm all in favor of deeper teaching, but maturity of faith in the Bible is so often evidenced by how we love others. So this is what Colossians 3:14 says. Don't miss this. It says, and over all these virtues, so this is something that's above the others, over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Now, if you're following the clothing metaphor here, you got to realize that they're not wearing the same kind of clothes that we wear. They're wearing robes, right? Or different levels of robes, because that's sometimes how they would protect themselves from the extreme heat. So, when it says here, put on love, which binds them all together, it's actually talking about a belt. I mean, that's what it's literally talking about, is put on a belt. And so I've actually brought myself a belt here today to illustrate the point, right? So it says to put on these virtues, right? And above all, put on love, which binds. So a belt, right? A belt would go on and around the robe. This is obviously not my belt. So above would go on and around the robe. And it would hold it in place. And it would be the primary thing that you see. See, we don't think of a belt like that. If you grew up where I grew up, you think of a belt means you're in trouble. Maybe you think of a belt as a fashion statement. But here, belt was the first thing that they would ultimately see. So it says, above all these virtues, put on love. Why? Because from our love from God, who saved us, we're indwelt now by the Holy Spirit, we're now living a different kind of life. This is what keeps the church together, is that reality of love. Love is like the belt. Right, now why? Because it holds all of these things together. Now, we find ourselves in 2019 with a divided world, and I believe the thing that the world needs most in the midst of its division is a united and loving church. Now again, notice how it's a community here, right? So above all these virtues, put on love. It's saying to the people here, the Colossians, right, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. It brings those things together. Now here's the thing, because the church here, the Colossians, actually had some people who were claiming like superior wisdom and knowledge. And Paul's pretty much saying, the Apostle Paul's pretty much saying here, listen, all your visions and all your special ideas and how super smart you are, you need love. That's what you need. You need to learn to love one another. Can I tell you, 2019, we can know every verse of the Bible from the beginning and the back, and if we're not loving, we're going to fail God's mission in our culture and in our time. So, but for sure, we need this loving church. Paul calls this elsewhere the more excellent way. So in the day where we live, right, where people are being discipled by their cable news choices and being spiritually shaped by their social media feed, Jesus shows us a better way. Paul calls it a more excellent way. A loving church in true community produces Christians who counter the age of rage. So that's when Pastor Rick asked me to talk about community. It's a big part of what I write about in Christians in the Age of Outrage, is that we together as God's people are showing a different way, a better way, what Paul the Apostle calls in 1 Corinthians, a more excellent way. It points to the power of a gospel-shaped people in the midst of a rage-filled world. Live like Jesus, do it with others, let love be your guide, and be thankful. Number four. And I want to talk about this one, because I think this speaks to some of the cause of why people are so angry today, including some Christians. I don't know, I can't say this without just being honest. There's a lot of Christians who've got a lot of rage online nowadays. And there's literally hundreds, maybe thousands at Saddleback that are struggling with this as well. Now, how then do we, and if it's online, it's just an expression. Online just gives us the opportunity to be the worst we can be without getting consequences here. By the way, you know what a loving community does? A loving community sees a sister or a brother acting in ungodly ways online and says, can I just speak love and grace and life into your life and say this may not be the best way to do this? But why? Because number 4 is dwell in peace. You see, this rage is fueled by often fear, or some form of anger, of loss. Dwell in peace. Listen to what it says. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. Since as members of one body, there's the unity of the community. Remember, this is counterculture community in the age of rage. Such as members of one body, you are called to peace and be thankful. Now, you might say, well, how can we have peace in our heart when all these things are going wrong around us? And I totally get it, right? And you may be in the midst of a personal, tumultuous situation. There may be something you say, Ed, I cannot have peace in this, and I get it. I've been there. I've been in the depths of despair or in the height of argument. I understand. But we can't live there, and at the end of the day, we have peace. Why? Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. Why? Because we have been called to peace. Here's why. You know why I can have peace in the midst of a tumultuous world? Here's why, right? I read the end of the book, Jesus wins. So I can look and say, well, if this election doesn't go the way I want, or if this promotion doesn't go the way I want, or if this neighborhood turns the way I didn't expect, I don't have to be angry or outraged. I can dwell in peace. Stop being so afraid, because fear produces anger, but trust produces peace. Let me give you an example, okay? So I've told you before, I have 3 daughters, which is so awesome and tiring at the same time. And they're 15, 17, and 21. So it's an awesome and tiring time. And so my middle daughter, her name's Jacqueline, and she's just like me. Middle child, I was a middle child. It looks like me. If you slap a goatee on her, you'd think it's me. And we're close, and I love Jacqueline. And so, but I remember when she was little, and sometimes, you miss those days when they're little. And I remember because we had a little swing set in the backyard, and Jacqueline, she'd climb up the swing set, and you could go down a slide up there, and the swings would kind of go offside. And there was this one section that you could sort of squeeze around, and you weren't supposed to do this, but you could jump from the top platform to wherever. Now, it was too high. If you jumped, you would fall and hurt yourself. So Jacqueline would never do that. But somewhere along the way, Jacqueline sees me walking by. I don't know how old she is, but she's just a few years old. Sees me walking by and says, "Daddy," and then throws herself into the air, into what was really not my arms, right? So she kind of hits me, and I grab her, right? And so we kind of had a thing, right? I would have to avoid that swing set because Jacqueline's waiting, here comes Dad, "Daddy!" And then she'd jump. And my job was to catch her. Now, here's the deal. If I didn't catch her, she was gonna break something. This was not a smart idea. But she had this sense in her that Dad's got this. Dad's got me. I don't have to, I can take a great leap into danger and whatever because my dad's got me. And I love that confidence she had in me and there were times when I'd say, "Come on," and she'd jump and it would just be a beautiful thing. But then she got bigger and I got older and it became harder and harder. But here's the thing. She knew in her head, my father's got this. I don't need to be afraid. My dad's got this. And here's the beauty I don't want you to miss, right? This is the kind of trust that a child has in an imperfect human father. And then we compare that to our heavenly Father. So our heavenly Father, and you're like, well, Ed, what about the politics of the day? Let me just tell you, Jesus is not coming back riding on a donkey or an elephant or whatever political symbol your country has. And he's not flying back on Air Force One or whatever aircraft your leader uses. Okay, so who's in the White House? If that's what causes your faith to grow or to wane, you have your confidence in the wrong individual. Or the prime minister or the leader of wherever you are. And it's not that you don't care about these things. We care about these things around the world. Christians are engaged and involved in issues of governance and politics and more. It's not that you don't care, it's that you don't fear because Jesus is more important and the Heavenly Father's got this. And it changes, you dwell in peace. So the peace that reigns in your heart is because of your trust in God. And then there's the phrase, "and be thankful," right there at the end. And be thankful. And it sounds just like I said it. It's an emphatic term. So it's Paul writing saying, "Oh, and be thankful." Now, for me, it immediately comes back to my kids, right? So my kids, they want to go to Disney World, and I say, "Listen, there's a park right down the road, and there's this little carousel that I can swing you on really, really, really fast." Like, "Dad, we want to go to Disney World." I say, "Listen, when I was a kid, we played on those carousels on concrete. We fell on concrete, and we were thankful, and we ate dirt, and we liked it." And so I told them, do you do that? Do you kind of do that with your kids sometimes? When I was a kid, I said, "Be thankful that I'm letting you go on the merry-go-round." Well, in a positive sense, this is a reminder, and be thankful. There's an emphatic nature to that. And be you and the community you're in, be thankful. See, the power of the gospel-shaped people in the midst of a rage-filled world is necessary. But here's the thing I don't want you to miss, right? You say, "Ed, I keep finding myself enraged and the output is not good." Let me just tell you, you want a new output? You want a gospel-driven, Jesus-shaped, these characteristics put on output? If you want a new output, it requires new input. You need to find new things in your heart that shape you. Maybe step away from the cable news channel. Step away from the social media and recognize that Christ is all and in all. That's where we started this passage, right? Verse 11, Christ is all and in all, because that's exactly what Paul writes to the church here, the Colossians. He says this, after laying all this out before us and ending with this, "and be thankful," he then says this, listen to it, listen to the beauty of it. "So let the message of Christ dwell among you richly. It's a community now. as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom, through psalms and hymns and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. And whatever you do it, whether in word or in deed, do it all to the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, giving thanks to God the Father through him. See, it's moved into the sense that if we're going to live as counterculture community in the age of rage, it's actually not going to be because we attended a Saddleback campus or watched online today. It's going to be in community. Again, that connection center where you can say, Pastor, I want to move from sitting in rows to sitting in circle to being in community with other people. And the beauty of this here, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another. That's where in small groups somebody is speaking to your heart and to my heart, singing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs with thankfulness in our heart to God. Why? Because Christ is all and in all. So here's what I don't want you to see. I don't want you to see this message as be nice to other people. I'm not that there's anything wrong with that. But I want you to see this message as you're not going to be driven by a culture of rage wherever you are in the world because you have met Christ. You are chosen, holy, and deeply loved. So you are going to put on these godly attributes, and your all-encompassing concern is Christ is all and in all. So what is filling your vision is the vision of the beauty of Christ in community with other believers, because we're talking counterculture community in the age of rage. And simply, you're going to live like Jesus. Do it with some others. Let love be your guide and be thankful. You know why? Because he's got us. He's got this. You don't have to live in fear. Your one angry comment that you want to use to try to change the political sphere or the server at the restaurant or the neighbor that's not listening, and you lose it and you dishonor Christ with your words, can I tell you, that's probably not going to make a difference. Leaders of the government are not actually monitoring your Facebook page waiting for you to tell them what to do. There's plenty of forces on them. You know what you've got? You've got Christ, and you've got a Father, and he's got this. So how do we live as counterculture community in the age of rage? We live that way by trusting in Christ. But how do we do this? By living like Jesus. Put this off, put on this. We are, so we put on. Do it with others. Get in a small group. Be a part of that community. Let love be your guide. Let it be the belt that holds it all together, and be thankful.